Okay, I'm unmuted. Thank you, Kate, for all your work on this. Thanks to all of you who are joining us, and most of all, thank you, Carolyn. It is very important to us to hear from women in politics, women in city council, women in city government. Many MCNY students don't understand that they can, as single moms, as working moms, aspire to join the city council. We had an alum run for city council, I think it was last year. The city council is so important to this city. And I look forward to more people understanding what it is that you do and the impact that the council has. I know that MCNY has been very grateful for city council support over the last couple of years for our food pantry initiative, for programs that we're running to help people in our communities get high school diplomas and some college education. We wouldn't have been able to start some key program without city council support. As Kate said, our mission is to bring more justice and more equity to the city. And I know that that's something that's critical to your work, Carolyn, and to the council, especially the new council. And we're really honored that you're taking your time to speak with us today. So thank you very much. It's all yours, Kate.
All right, I'll just turn it over to Carolyn to get us started, and we'll see how it all goes. Thank you. Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you, everyone, for giving me this opportunity to share space with you all and share what it was to run for city council in this past election. I was just thinking about like the work that I've done over the past decade and how that also like intertwined with MCNY. So I feel like very full circle right now. So thank you for the opportunity. So like Kate had mentioned, I was a candidate for city council in District 25, which are neighborhoods Elmhurst and Jackson Heights in Queens. Unfortunately, did not win the primary, but I had been working in this district for over a decade for the current council member. And so so many layers about this race was so blatant, I was saying, and I will definitely touch upon that and really what the driving force to run, because I had never had any intentions in the 10 years that I worked in city council to ever run for office. And I actually did not like this side of politics because I saw really how toxic and how corrupt the culture of politics can be, especially for women, women of color, queer folks, gender nonconforming, and working class people and single parents. And so, you know, when we started the campaign, it was really to be a catalyst to disrupt that and to build more spaces where people like us who are not traditionally welcome to run. And so we came in 7 months ago, in the beginning of December, we launched our campaign, and we really created a strong momentum in this district that focused really on our communities that had been historically ignored and marginalized. And you know, if folks remember during the pandemic, this district was the epicenter of the pandemic, right? Elmhurst really bore the brunt of that. And mostly those were inequities that had already been in place. They were just only exposed by the pandemic. So our mostly working class, low income immigrant communities were at the center of the pandemic, right? And they saw no relief. And so being in government at that time, it was really traumatic, but it was also, you know, eye-opening to see like there is this pandemic and our city has failed our community, right? There were no additional testing sites, no additional resources, no support for families and neighbors who didn't have access to healthcare, who didn't have the language support. And it really was an experience to see, well, what is the role of government then, right? So a little bit about me and how I came to this. I became very politicized when I started college at San Francisco State University in the early 2000s. And what really politicized me was when I was taking Asian American Studies courses. And that's when I learned about, the role of Asian Americans in civil society, in the civil rights and social justice movement, and how connected it is with other communities of color. So, across the bridge, we had the Black Panthers. At San Francisco State was where the Third World Liberation Front strike started. And so, it set me on a path where I saw justice that was rooted in movements, right? And that I was very critical about government, very critical about politicians, because they always seem to be repeating the same toxic patterns, or that we only inch a little bit, right? And so that was kind of really my placement when I started as an intern in Councilmember Drum's office almost 12 years ago, right? I saw myself as somebody who was going to absorb the information, tools of this industry so that I can go back to grassroots movements, to organizations who are on the ground, to utilize that to support our communities. And so that has always been my placement. And I think that's also why I always rejected the notion of running for office, right? Because I saw myself as more of like an insider influence as opposed to running for office. But definitely the pandemic changed all that, and really seeing what was at stake for our district, that we were going to continue to perpetrate leadership that did not uphold working class voices, or really only tokenized us, right? And so to run, it meant there was an intention to use this campaign as a way to organize and educate our communities about issues that impact their everyday lives. And that, regardless of the outcome of the election, I feel like we in the campaign was able to really start that momentum in our community. So a little bit about Elmhurst and Jackson Heights is that Elmhurst is predominantly more immigrant, more working class, right? And there are a lot of communities that are newer, that are definitely underserved. So we have our Burmese, Thai, Indonesian, Filipino, Latinx communities outside of a small part of Jackson Heights that do not get the services, do not get the support they need. What we have seen over the, I guess, decades, right, is that the historic district of Jackson Heights, which is mostly affluent homeowners, mostly white, really make up the decision of our political landscape from city, state to federal. And so we are a predominantly working class community of immigrants that don't really know the power of their collective voice. And so we set out to really change that and to really engage with communities who had never been involved in electoral politics before, because they were never seen as valuable, right? I think oftentimes it's a numbers games for candidates and politicians, and it's like, well, let's look to see who votes. We're only going to go and focus on those people to try to swing that. And then we neglect everybody else who are seen as, the word that I heard recently about communities was like, I forgot the word, but it was basically, it just says like, we're not the ones that are prioritized because we're not the ones that consistently vote or are engaged. So we wanted to definitely change that. But on top of that, I also wanted to really heighten the issues about the role of women in government, in city politics, but also what it is like to run, right? So I started in the office as an intern. I worked my way up to eventually become the chief of staff. And, in the 12 years that the council member has been the council member, I have been the only non-white male chief of staff to ever hold that position in the office, right? I am the longest chief of staff, but I think it really speaks volumes about how our work is often undervalued and invisible, right? Especially the labor of women of color. Because in those 12 years, not once was I ever asked by my employer what are your dreams, Carolyn? What do you aspire to be, and how can I help you get there? Or how can we use this position to help you grow? It was always just about my labor. And I think that really speaks volumes about how our labor is really seen as disposable when it is no longer needed, right? Or that we are expendable. And so we wanted to really, I mean, I think it's a lived experience that really also impact the way I see the world and politics, but how, as a woman of color, we often get overlooked for opportunities to grow. And that was just so blatant in this race. Because my boss did go on to endorse the person who won, which was another man. So, I think it really speaks how much work that we need to do around gender inequities, around the labor of women. And those were conversations that were not happening until we were bringing that up in this campaign. And then on top of that, to be, to run, it takes a lot. So I have 2 young daughters. They're about to be 5 and 9. And so for them, like, this experience was also for them because they had basically grown up in the office with me. When they were babies, I would nurse them in the office. I would, we lived very close. And so they grew up seeing their mom, run the office, do a lot of the things that the council member couldn't do when he was unavailable, but I was always behind the scenes or behind the desk. And so to run was also to show them that our role is not only behind the desk or behind the scenes, that if we want to shift, that we are able to. And so that was very important to me as a parent, to really show my daughters that this is hard work, but it is important, right? And that, I think we have to normalize, for me, we have to normalize justice and these conversations really at an early age, because I don't want my daughters to grow up saying, like, that it's okay to accept behavior like this, or that, if they see somebody being unjustly treated, that is acceptable, right? So I think starting early and normalizing that is so important. And so, it was a tough 7 months to run. Oftentimes, I think we, as women, we internalize a lot of imposter syndrome, right? Or, even though I had done the work really for the last 12 years, the only candidate to have that experience of navigating city bureaucracy, understanding this community in a way that no other candidate had, I had to constantly really justify why I was the most qualified candidate, right? I think us being intentional about not hiring consultants, using people from our community who are already organizing, who are already leaders, was not seen as like a viable pathway, right? Why, when we were intentionally going to communities that had been ignored, that we were intentional about hiring people from our community who spoke our languages, was not going to be the winnable or the victory path, right? And so it really, on a personal level, it was heartbreaking, but on a more larger scale, really showed to me like the work that needs to happen, right? And in the city council, I think it's an interesting landscape, because we have never seen that many women run for office this past election and then really win, right? So a lot of, I think this year we will see, or the next incoming council class, we will have more women as city council members that we will see ever. But it's interesting how in this district where, we elected AOC, Senator Jessica Ramos, Assemblymember Jessica Gonzalez Rojas, and Assemblymember Catalina Cruz, that this one last seat did not go to a woman of color, right? Or a progressive woman of color who has been doing the work. So it is very interesting to see how that really played out. And how I think a lot of it is that our continuing critique about power dynamics in this district, how, we were not afraid to be bold about our values. We were also the only campaign to be calling for at least a $3 billion cut to the New York Police Department's budget, right? No other candidate was calling for that. No other candidate was calling for radical changes as much as us. Was really seen as not palatable to the predominantly, historic district folks. So, those were my experience. I think a lot of times too, running, I always felt like I was not doing enough. And it was always so hard, I think, to balance that, right? Because as a working parent, there was times when I could not go to some events. I could not do certain things because I needed to be there for my children. But the absence of not being there also then hurt the campaign, right? Because then it shows like, oh, well, you're not campaigning hard enough, or you don't care about this. And so it was like a constant push and pull for me to how I show up in spaces, and how I really also wanted to be intentional about that too, because to be in campaign events means that I was intentionally away from my children, right? And so wanting to really highlight that and say like, working parents need to be at the table. Our experiences, our analysis, our voices is so critical to the progress of working families in this city that we can't just say, yes, we support X, Y, and Z if we don't have those experiences. And so that was always really difficult. And that's something that I recently did an interview with a business. She is a cannabis single parent mother. And we talked about how important it is for parents to really be at the table when we talk about cannabis as well. And it really just made me think like there's so many issues that working class parents, especially single moms, experience where we have no say in anything, where our voices are not seen because maybe somebody who is better expert policy analysis, or who has been doing the work in that field, gets prioritized or uplifted over our voices, even though those policies, those experiences directly impact us. So, I'm going to constantly be the person who reminds people like, hey, we need the voices and the work of women of color, of single parents, to be at the table, because when we talk about childcare, the people who are most impacted are their caregivers, right? And so we can't be making policies about childcare if there are no caregivers or single moms at the table. Talk about healthcare, right? Talk about criminal justice. These are all issues that impact us very different than other communities. And so, I feel like I'm going in like circles, and I hope this is all cohesive and helpful. What also was intentional about us was that we wanted to really build a grassroots campaign that supported the leadership of women of color, of queer folks, of our elders, right? And so we were intentional about making intergenerational spaces that were multi-ethnic, that had different languages, right? Because in a community like ours that are so diverse, we often function in silos, right? Like there are not a lot of opportunities to build together. And that's so important for us to build a solid voice of working class folks in this district, right? And so that is the work that we are continuing to do, because, I try to remind everybody, it doesn't matter who wins at the end of the day, because that work is still gonna need to happen, and it's gonna continue. And so the real power is being able to organize and flex that power to have politicians, to have elected officials do what you need them to do, right? And so, yes, we won, and I think we ran and we were able to push our opponents a little bit more left, but that doesn't mean that our work stops because we didn't win the primary, right? We had to keep pushing. And so it's been about a month and a half since the primary. It's been a learning experience, because I had never thought that I would do this, right? Like in a pandemic, being a single parent, run for office. But reflecting in the last month and a half since the election has been, really a life-changing experience, because it really showed me how much work we have to do with our communities, with our fellow women as well, right? I think what we saw, just like from observation, that a lot. Oh, and the other thing that was really important to us that we always wanted to uplift was the importance of intersectionality, right? And I think as a self-identified feminist and as a woman of color, intersectionality is so important to push us, right? Because what we've seen in the past is that white feminism does not get us far enough, right? When there was affirmative action that really benefited white women, right? And I think in this district and this race predominantly, intersectionality was not highlighted enough, right? And that's why we saw a lot of the votes that did not come to this campaign was from white women, right? Working class moms, parents, right? Who, you know, I think if they understood, then they would have really realized the value of this seat for a working class parent, single parent, right? But because, you know, I think the lack of intersectionality, the comfort of somebody not questioning their own politics or their sense of comfort was detrimental to our campaign. So intersectionality is so important because we have to approach answers, policies with that lens, because everybody's experience is not the same. So I love to have a conversation, open up to questions, or answer anything that anybody has.
Thank you so much. If folks feel like turning on their cameras, if you're in a position where you feel comfortable doing that, that can help people feel like they're speaking to not a blank space. I know that's always nice. Does anybody want to start? Desi, you're always good for a question.
Good afternoon. It's good to meet you, Carolyn. I did look up your campaign and I was so jazzed about how much social justice was incorporated into it. And I was really pleased, and I was hoping to see a better outcome for you, but totally understand why there wasn't one. And I have two questions, but I'll start with my first one. I'd be interested in, because I didn't hear a lot of this from folks of Asian descent around a lot of the violence that was happening with Asian communities, and it was just so disheartening to see, and angering actually is really the word. I was really pissed about it, not only because it was happening, but because it was being fueled by the last administration. And so that was just so, it burned my butter, let's just say that. But what I was going to say in terms of what I did not hear is there was a lot of call for an understanding of the Asian community, rightfully so, and also really understanding the position and the value and the contributions of Asian communities to the United States of America. But what I didn't hear is a lot of an alignment with other communities of color, particularly Black communities who experience that on a regular basis. And Black communities oftentimes don't feel a lot of solidarity from other communities of color for many reasons. But there is anti-Blackness that resides in a lot of communities of color, non-Black communities of color. And I'd be really interested in hearing people who are having these conversations on a larger platform like yourself around ways to create not just more solidarity between communities of color, but really rooting out anti-Blackness in non-Black communities of color.
Thank you. That is a great question, and thank you for bringing that up. You know, when the shooting in Atlanta happened, right? That was mostly Asian women who worked in massage parlors, right? I think it opened up this opportunity for us to talk about the intersectionality, about anti-Asian violence and how that specifically impacts women, immigrants, right, sex workers, and those who are in industries that are not protected in a way that we had never before, right? And you know, it's something that, you know, I always try to raise, because it is, you know, Black social justice movements that politicize me, right? Like I had mentioned, it was the Black Panthers, but it was learning about Richard Aoki, who was a Black Panther. He was a Chinese American man in Oakland, and he was a Black Panther, learning about learning about Yuri Kochiyama, right, who actually held Malcolm X when he was shot, and worked alongside with him in Harlem. You know,
her.
Oh, great. So it was really learning about, for me, that's what politicized me, was learning about the solidarity between communities of color, particularly the Asian American community and Black communities, right? And so it is always work that I have tried to highlight, and work that when anti-Asian violence became more heightened in media, we really also wanted to remind people, like, there's been this solidarity between our communities, but white supremacy wants to divide us, doesn't want to teach us about this history together, because if people know, then people are gonna come together and organize, right? And so when we talked about anti-Asian violence, it was also to remind people, like, anti-Asian violence is a part of US history for as long as Asians have been here. And that, you know, our Black communities are also being brutalized, right? Like, we were saying, in calling for answers or solutions to anti-Asian violence, it does not mean for the increased policing of our communities, right? Which often impacts, disproportionately impacts our Black and Brown communities, right? We're calling for more resources into mental health so that people are receiving the services and support that they need before any of this can happen, that the education, that the spaces to create a multi-ethnic coalition and spaces between our Black, between our Asian, is being done, right? And I think that this is work as Asians is important to also have, and to also recognize that anti-Blackness is well and alive in our community, right? And that we need to talk about that, and we need to have those conversations. And so, you know, that is work that we really also try to highlight by uplifting the organizers in our community who have been doing that work, and really seeing that we're not only saying, yes, like we stand in solidarity with our Black and Brown communities, but we're also saying that these are the demands that they're asking. They're asking to cut the police budget by $1 billion. And we are going to stand in solidarity with that. We are going to be educating our community about why we need to defund. We are going to be talking about the relationships and the solidarity of Asian Americans and Black activists in this community for so long, right? And so I think that work often gets ignored or not highlighted, because there is the potential to really change things if it is so prevalent that there is a solidarity between us.
Thank you, Carolyn. Also, I do have a deep love for that particular community. I lived in Corona, which is to Elmhurst. The post office always seems to default to East Elmhurst for some reason, but I lived there for 20 years and
wow,
did a lot of social justice work, particularly around food justice and growing food in communities around Queens and the Bronx and the larger New York area. But I grew food right in my home and use it as a space to teach young people about food justice. So I have a deep love for East Elmhurst.
Well, hope you'll be able to come back and visit soon.
Who else? Does anybody else want to jump in? Well, I'm interested in what's next, both for you personally and how it sort of connects with your vision that you've been talking about in terms of kind of leveling up these progressive local movements.
That was actually my other question. I was going to ask, like, what's next? Like, you worked in an office for a gentleman who endorsed another person. So like, are you guys having coffee and bagels together?
No, there is no coffee or bagels happening. But I mean, so we're continuing to organize our communities that we were able to engage with, particularly our Southeast Asian communities, right? In Elmhurst that are highly underserved and have no organization or agency to go to, right? So we've talked about creating a project that does day-to-day organizing, right? Not just for a campaign, not just for an issue, but to really build the leadership and the collective thinking of our community. And so those are the early stages that we've been thinking about and how we do that, right? Because we can't just stop now that we lost the primary, right? It's even more important now, in my opinion, to continue to engage, because, you know, if folks are were not interested before and got excited about campaigns or about an election this time, and we stop showing up, then it only contributes to their thinking that politicians only show up when they need something in their community, right? And so we are talking about how do we build that power in our communities, starting first with our Southeast Asians, who, you know, like myself being the daughter of Vietnamese refugees, have a complete different experience than our newer Southeast Asian immigrants now, right? You know, most of them did not come from war, you know, some are very new in this country, and so don't understand really, you know, how to get services from their city government or from their city, and really how to navigate, right? We always joke that like people will know who their mayor or who their leaders in their home country are, but don't know who their council members or don't know who their local representatives are. And so, you know, we need to kind of shift that. But, and then also personally, I'm taking the rest of the summer to spend it with my daughters before they go back to school, and then to think professionally what I'm gonna do next.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in? Dita Artavini, are you there? I'm wondering, I'm thinking about you because you work a lot around feminism and teaching feminism, and I wonder how this sort of concept of thinking past white women's feminism
you know,
is playing out for you in the context of MCNY. And
yeah, I found the comments, Carolyn's comments, very insightful in that she was talking about how the white feminism kind of overlooks the impact of the experience of the double and triple jeopardies of other communities. So that is really important that we share that. You know, it's sad that our white foremothers in feminism didn't think of turning back and reaching and making a complete sisterhood. Instead of having just feminism, have the womanism that we share together as a collective. So I think just seeing the multiplicity of experiences and the complexity of experiences, speaking out and not having white women speak for women of color is very important. It's sad because what we have is that if a white woman says it, and it's similar to white women, if a man says it, it has more power to it, it has more validity. That shouldn't be so. And we see that white women are doing the same thing to women of color. You know, if we say it's valid, right? We can no longer do that. And I think that it paints women of color as puerile and unable to speak for themselves. So I think that's why I tried to stay quiet, because it's not my job to speak for you. It's my job to clear the way so that you can speak for yourself. That I find to be very, very important. I'm just a conduit of to help you, and that's about it. And cheer you on and support my sisters. That's just how I see it. And you know, see more faces. And the diversity of faces is very important, at least to me.
thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, no, definitely agree. I mean, I think so many layers, right? Not only you know, white feminism, but also like about class and how, you know, their choices also support, you know, their lifestyle or their economic status too. And so it's just, yeah, you know, I agree, like having the multitude of diversity of voices and faces is so important.
You know,
Yeah.
and I applaud you for bringing your children to see you work, because that plants a seed in and of itself. I'm a mother of 21-year-old twins. One's a boy, one's a girl. And I did the same thing. I would bring them to the office. I would breastfeed in my office and do all these other things, where then fast forward, you know, 20 years later, my son actually saying at the dinner table, yeah, I never thought that I was a feminist, but yeah, until I went to college and started to hear the way other people would speak, and I would not like it and reject it, that mom, yeah, you raised yourself a feminist. So it's just by role modeling. So whenever I see a woman, and in this case, even at MCNY, you know, talking to women that have children, and my thing is, I'm not going to tell you they can't come in. I'm going to celebrate them coming in, because they need to see that mommy can do it. It's not just
Yeah.
a man's world.
And I think oftentimes as caregivers, as mothers, like it's not a choice, right? Like we have to do it. Like I didn't choose to bring my kids because it was something that, you know, was easy to do at work. It was fun. I was like, I have to breastfeed. I don't have other childcare. And so I need to take care of my children. And, you know, luckily I had an employer who was supportive of that. But, you know, it was not because of luxury, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
so, yeah.
It's so true. I think that there was a webinar that we did a few months ago where we talked about women in positions and how trying to do these things that we need to do. And when I was asked to speak and be the keynote speaker, I basically said that I lived my life on this motto: no other option. Like I had no other option but to bring my children with me. I had no other option but to work the many jobs that I worked at to support my family as a single mother. So it's like when people would say, how do you do it? I don't have any other option. So, you know, no is not a response. I can't is not, you know, and I think we need to look at that and say, why isn't that we're not allowing and affording women the option to say no? That we're stuck between a rock and a hard place because we're expected to do this without any thanks or without any praise or without any, you know, when we look at the things that particularly women of color and low income women go through, they are the canaries that we send down to the mines, right? Because those things, one of these days, are going to end up starting to impact the people that apparently are defined as important in our society. And it's sickening. You know, let's look at childcare. Why is it that more corporations aren't open and you know, institutions or whatever are not more open to affording for affordable childcare, letting the children come so that the mother can breastfeed, not frowning upon breastfeeding in public, you know.
Yeah, of course, you know,
is really, I think, important to understand, because if women are bringing children to the workplace or breastfeeding or doing anything that is considered domestic, it's all there is always this sort of skeptical lens. But if men do it, it's cute. Oh, look at what he did. He brought his daughter to work, and isn't that great that he brought his son to teach him what he's doing? The optics of it look completely different, and the narrative around men bringing their children to work it's a completely different conversation.
And of course, the option to bring your children to work is an option that is one of privilege, right?
Yeah.
There are only certain kinds of jobs where you could possibly do that. So it always becomes about how do you level it up and make the systemic change, right? Which is making childcare affordable.
You know, and it also works the other way. Is when are we going to allow men to realize that they are also 50% of that parenting equation, right? So allowing for men to, if they want to be stay-at-home dads, and not seeing that as emasculating. You know, those are things that are important, that we have to really break those the straitjacket of gender roles and gender norms. You know, it's going to be a long path. As much as we think we've come a long way, we still have so much further to go.
Yeah.
And to go together.
And it's interesting that you bring that up because, one thing that, that my opponent always liked to highlight and identify as was as a dad, right? And in the beginning, when I saw that, I'm like, like my identity as like a single parent is part of me, but it's not what I label myself. Like I think like when you run for office, you have to have like identity, like a renter, all these things, right? But it was never really anything that like I put on my mailers or I put on like, even though like my identity was as a single mom, it was interesting how recognizing that you're a parent as a dad received much more maybe support or attention, right? Than me being a single mom. And like it was interesting because again, by choice, right? Like when this person decided to bring their children, they were applauded, right? I think when I brought my children, it was also recognized like, oh, well, she has no other choice. But when this person did not bring their children, it was like, well, who is at home taking care of your kids, right? It is your partner. It is the mother of your children doing that labor so that you can campaign. And so it was just always like a very frustrating, like disconnect,
Yes.
right? And
the double standard of the optics is there, prevalent, continuous.
I want to give a moment if anyone else wants to jump in, if anyone's thinking of anything that they're considering saying. I urge you to voice your feelings and thoughts.
Well, I'm just gonna say thank you, Carolyn, for sharing with us, for coming and speaking to us. A lot of things that you said about being a mom and a single mom, and also wanting to hold and holding powerful positions, really resonated with me. I think that those of us who are trying to have it all, it's often you have to choose between one or the other, and our employers, they're going to continue to run whether we're here or not, but our children definitely do need us, but we shouldn't have to choose. So continue to do the work, and I'll continue to do the work, and we'll all continue to try to create a better world for our daughters.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm talking about this sort of continuing to do the work. We're on the cusp of a new administration, a new city government. What are your thoughts on what we should be expecting and what we should be getting in gear to do?
I think we should be, prepared for a lot of fighting between the city council and the incoming mayor. Like we've supposedly, I think overall, looking at the different elections, I think the city moved more centrist, right? Like we did elect a former cop as our next mayor, right? Who wants to bring back stop and frisk, who does not support defund, right? And so like, I think a lot of the progress that we've made in terms of social justice for our communities are gonna be at risk, right? And I think progressive is such a watered down term these days, right? Like, they said that this is the most progressive, but I think this is really just the most neoliberal city council, or really like
Agreed.
Administration, right? I think like that is the problem, that we don't move, we don't make systematic changes because we're so comfortable with just moving inches. And so I think and the other thing is, I don't know if people realize that the city council is up for re-election in 2 years because of redistricting. So everybody who won the primary and gets elected in November is going to have to run again in 2 years. And so that will also then change the dynamic of the city council. The mayor will be Eric Adams for the next 4 years, but the city council will be completely different in 2 years as well. So I think we'll see, I think a lot of former policies are going to be brought back because of like the fear mongering of rising crime. I think as a backlash to BLM, right? And the pandemic we're going to see a lot of maybe step backs or really stagnant, right? We're just going to be constantly fighting. So. Yeah.
Are you interested in running again?
You know, we had talked about that. I think only like the main goal for us is to always build a solid organized working class voice in this district. And so if we are able to flex our power to get the needs to do what we get, to have electeds do what we want, then there's really no need for us to run, right? I think it's in the case where our electeds are not doing what we need them to. Maybe, but it's not out of the possibilities. I mean, it is a lot. I am not committed really to the idea of it having to be me, right? I think that if within our movement and in our collective finds that there is a stronger candidate who could win and who wants to do it, right? Then I'm all for that, you know, because it was never about me. It was just that we needed somebody who had the experience and who had the ability to bring our communities together to run. So I fully, you know, in Jackson, Mississippi, there is a case where the community came together and picked who they wanted to run, right? And I think that's the most quote unquote progressive way, right? It's not somebody wakes up and says, I want to be the next elected official. And so they don't consult or they're not connected with movements. It's always the other way around. And that's what we were also really trying to introduce was like concepts of co-governance because the models that we have now for leadership really is a failure, right? We put all of our hopes and desires in one person, hoping that they make the right decision. And once they are in office, we just don't realize that there's so many external pressures in place, right? That even though if you come in with certain values, you may vote against that because your own personal power is at risk, or that, you know, you don't want to go against like the speaker or the mayor or your colleagues, right? And so you know, really exploring different models of co-governance was something that we were experimenting with.
And so what does that look like? How do you actually do that?
So, you know, I think it's a model that is going to fail before we actually find one that succeeds. And we were hoping to really introduce like a council that works in partnership with the elected official, with the city council, right? And so I think what we need to shift in our culture is this also idolizing of elected officials as like the savior or as the person who knows a complete answer, because nobody does not know the whole answer, right? And that person should really be going to people who are on the ground, connected to communities who have been doing the work. So I think we need to start shifting that idea of like seeing electeds as like celebrities or as, you know, the only people who can enact change, and really shifting it back to movements, right? And reminding people like the way that progress and change happens is through movements, right? Like the excluded worker funds only happen because workers, grassroots organizations were organizing. They were coordinating hunger strikes, right, to demand that our essential workers qualify for relief after being left out of so much resources in the first phase of the pandemic.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. We have a few minutes left if anyone else cares to jump in and share your thoughts. Do you recognize some of the same issues in your neighborhoods as the pressing issues? Ms. Robinson, any closing thoughts? I was about to say that I nominate you to run for city council.
Well, it's funny that you say that. I haven't made any announcements yet, but I am putting some feelers out around public service and have already been in 2 training programs. And so, you know, as Carolyn said, it's quite an undertaking. And I think one of the things that I recognize is that it isn't solely about me. It really is about me being a vehicle to amplify voices that just aren't being heard. And I recognize that I walk through the world with a simultaneous amount of oppression and privilege. And so I amplify my voice to lift the oppression that people like me continue to have. And I recognize fully that as a citizen, as an English speaker, as a straight person, as a person who has education, as a person who has a deep network of diverse people, a coalition who support me, that I can use those parts of my world and my existence and my identity to continue to do the work that Carolyn and so many others here, wish to do. And so if it isn't solely about winning, and if it is about pushing, then that's, where the work is, that's where I'll do the work. So haven't made any announcements yet, but I would love actually to talk with you, Carolyn. And what I would ask you to do is to pick your favorite place in the district, and I will come there and I will have a meal with you.
Definitely.
So please let me know how to get in touch with you.
Yeah, definitely. I will put my personal email here too. So if anybody needs it, you can always reach out to me. But I always encourage anybody who is interested to explore it, right? I think we need more women of color to normalize these ideas of running for public office, right? And something that I always say is that no man ever questions themselves, right? But we always doubt ourselves. We always I think I heard that like when there's a job description or a job opening, men only feel like they need to be able to do 30 to 40% of that, but women feel like we need to do 70% of that to even consider applying, right? And so I think just normalizing that like public office, being a public servant is a career path that is viable for us is something we need to normalize.
Absolutely. I've read those same
Agree. It's so true when you were talking about the imposter syndrome, how we go through our lives, thinking, oh, I'm going to fake it until I make it, until we realize, I got this. I know this. And it takes a while. And trust me, being a woman of a certain age, as I sigh, it'll come. It comes. But there are days where I just look in the mirror and I'm like, please don't let it show today. Just don't let it show.
Yeah. And then also how that gets perceived, right? Like we get seen as like either being overconfident or like, too cocky when we are sure about ourselves in that way. So, if one thing like I want to have built a future for my daughters where they don't second guess themselves, where like they know that like they don't have to prove themselves just to be at the same level, and I think we yearn for that for all of our kids and our future leaders.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much for taking the time. This was a beautiful conversation, and I hope that you and Desi get to connect because
I'll send you guys photos.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.